Alright, hello everyone on a very exciting Tuesday, October the 6th, budget night. It's 8 p.m. The budget's just come out at 7:30. Are you pumped? I'm pumped. Let's all be pumped. I'm totally not doing this in my pajamas, even though technically I am, but we're all excited about the budget. Let's talk through some of the key policies that are going to be important to you in VCE economics. There's a lot in there, but when it comes down to doing it in VCE economics, there's only going to be a handful of things you need to talk about. And so let's hammer in on a few of those really clearly and not get bogged down in the massive amount of information that comes out in the budget. So we're going to look at the stance of the budget, basically the amount of deficit that it is. We're going to look at a few of the forecasts that they put out, what they think the key economic goal is going to become in the next couple of years. Then we're going to look at the tax cuts for personal income, for regular people, and the impact they're likely to have on the economic goals. We're going to look at the infrastructure projects they've announced, and I'll talk about how many of those you should really know about, and then some of the aggregate supply side policies that have been put into it and throughout the year that are really going to be good to talk about later on your exam. So let's get straight into it. So straight from the summary, we have that the government has an underlying cash balance for 2021 of 213.7 billion, the largest deficit in history in Australia. That's massive, equivalent to 11% of GDP. The largest deficit in history, obviously to cushion the blow of the coronavirus and the fact that Melbourne's still in lockdown. But when we're looking at this, it's a deficit, and it's a large deficit, so you've got to talk about this as being expansionary in nature. So it is expansionary. It'll be interesting to see what they ask about this on the end of your exam, but this budget is definitely expansionary. It's trying to increase the size of the economy that's rapidly shrinking because of the coronavirus. So they're trying to make sure that we don't shrink. They're trying to make sure the economy doesn't contract. They're injecting money into the economy to expand it. Then it goes on to say about the fact that they estimate the deficit to be 66.9 billion in 2023-24, and further improve over the medium term to a deficit of 49.5 billion in 2030-2031. One important thing about that you should note, that shows that they're expecting that we're going to be in deficit for at least another decade. And there are some ramifications of that, thinking about the fact that we are going to be racking up more and more debt, which means we have to pay interest on that debt. That goes in net, that's a debit to net primary incomes in our current account, means we're probably more likely to be in a current account deficit in the long term. Also much more in terms of net foreign debt, all those kind of things that affect Unit 3, Area Study 3, important to think about, could come up in terms of a question about the level of public debt and the overall impacts of that. Being able to quote some of this would be brilliant in terms of a high level answer. So some of the forecasts for our key economic goals. So looking at what they're expecting 2020, 2021, real GDP is going to be -1.5. So they're expecting a little bit of a bounce back from our -6.3 that we're currently at. They're expecting the employment rate to, we don't really care about the employment rate, to be honest. They're expecting the unemployment rate to be about 7.25, and they're expecting next year for that to go down to 6.5, then 6, and then 5.5. So they're expecting these policies are going to be really effective at bringing the unemployment rate down. They're expecting inflation to kind of hover below the goal. So as you can see here, 1.75, 1.5, 1.75, and 2. So it's unlikely that we're going to achieve the goal of low inflation anytime soon. So that's an interesting point to look at in terms of whether the parameters from the goal may be changed in the near future based on the situation, but it's unlikely we're going to achieve that anytime soon. Then we have wage price index, so how much wages are increasing. They're expecting that to increase fairly in line with inflation. And nominal GDP, they're expecting to be fairly similar to real GDP, but we don't care about that too much because real GDP is more accurate based on the fact that it includes inflation. And so looking at personal tax cuts, we're going to look at this and then we're going to look at the actual tax rates that people are paying. This is just kind of show in general the benefit that it's going to have. So based on the amount of income people pay, income tax people pay, everyone is getting some level of tax relief as long as you pay tax. So someone who pays $40,000 or has an income of $40,000 is going to pay $1,060 less in tax, so they're 21.4% better off. Someone who earns $80,000 is going to pay $2,160 less, so they're 11% better off. Then you see someone on $200,000 a year, they're paying $2,565 less in these new tax cuts, and they'll be 3.8% better off. What this is showing is that basically every household that pays tax is going to have more money in their pocket. This means this should translate to higher private consumption spending, higher aggregate demand, and therefore hopefully greater levels of economic growth, higher rates of inflation, so that's not going to happen anytime soon, higher rates of employment as businesses have to respond to that increased aggregate demand and increased demand for goods and services. All right, so now we're going to look at the new personal income tax rates and thresholds. So basically what's happening is currently we have 4 main tax brackets where you had paid 19%, 32.5%, 37%, or 45%. Basically, that's eventually going to be cut down by July 24 to 19%, a middle income bracket of 30%, and a high income bracket of 45%. So meaning that for the people who earn between $45,000 and $200,000, there's going to be no bracket creep. Basically, no matter how much more they earn, they're going to pay the same tax rate, which is going to benefit them because they're not going to need to worry about paying more tax overall. And this will mean that there's more money in their pocket and going to be more consumption spending, and then more aggregate demand, employment, economic growth, etc. All right, so to get onto some actual policy. So first up, we're going to look at infrastructure spending. With infrastructure spending, there's a whole lot of projects, but the effects are always the same. So I always really recommend knowing one project really well, maybe 2 if you're in a bind. But so we've got ones here like $2.7 billion for New South Wales, including $603 million for New England Highway, Singleton Bypass, Bolivia Hill upgrade, and an additional $491 million for a Coffs Harbour bypass. So if you're interested in New South Wales, feel free to go with that. $1.1 billion for Victoria, including $528 million for upgrades to the Shepparton and Warrnambool rail lines. That's probably what I'd be going for because we are Victorian, therefore it makes sense to go with the Victorian policy. Then you'll be talking about the fact that that will improve our aggregate supply because we're going to be more efficient, we're going to be faster in travel times, it's going to bring down the cost of production for businesses. In the short term, it's going to create jobs, and in the long term, it will hopefully increase our productive capacity and create more employment and growth because of that. There are many other ones there. If you like any other ones, because they're shorter maybe, like $360 million for Tasmania, including $65 million for Tasman Bridge upgrade, feel free to go with that. I prefer to just go with the Victorian one. Rail lines, really simple, really easy to explain how that's going to benefit aggregate supply. Then we've got some directly aggregate supply side policies. So $15.6 billion in additional spending for the JobKeeper payments that have been extended up until March 2021. It's really interesting to look at this one because this is presented in a really positive light, but you could actually talk about the fact that the changing the eligibility requirements and decreasing the rates that's being paid for JobKeeper is actually going to mean it's going to have a negative effect. So I'd really recommend looking into this one in a little bit more detail, because if you see what it originally was and what it is now, it's changed a lot. They're expecting there to be a significant amount of newly unemployed people based on how it's changed this week. So I'd recommend looking at that in a bit more detail. That'd be great for a discuss type question because it's almost an example of government failure, because originally there were a lot of businesses that were operating that are never going to reopen because of the JobKeeper payment. They called them zombie businesses. They were operating because the government was paying their wages basically through this wage subsidy, and it means when the wage subsidy goes away, they're just going to lay those workers off and stop operating. So that's an interesting one to look at. Increasing the government infrastructure investment pipeline by $10 billion to $110 billion, so it just means $10 billion more dollars for infrastructure. You could also look at that as aggregate demand in terms of increased government spending. $4 billion for JobMaker hiring credit to give businesses incentives to take on additional employees that are aged 16 to 35 years old. So basically, this helps with business cost of production to bring it down and encourages them to hire young people. So the government will pay a percentage of their wage basically for a period of time if they hire young people. So that should hopefully create more jobs. So job creation, which is obviously benefit, it's going to benefit full employment, but also increase our productive capacity because we'll have more labour, hopefully being more effective. 1.2 billion to support 100,000 new apprentices and trainees with a 50% wage subsidy. So the government will pay half the wages of 100,000 new apprentices. So that's going to create a lot of jobs because a lot of businesses aren't taking on apprentices at the moment because they're afraid they can't pay them. This gives them more incentive to do that, creates more jobs, increase our productive capacity, increase our aggregate supply. The government will invest an additional $2 billion through research and development tax incentives. So you should already know about this tax incentive of the tax offset businesses get for conducting research and development, but the government's giving an additional $2 billion to that to help innovative businesses that invest in research and development. Key tip I gave in Aggregate Supply, whenever you talk about research and development, say if it's successful, that will be the case, but this means more businesses will be able to conduct research and development to come up with innovative ideas that will benefit Australia in the future to increase our productive capacity and aggregate supply. And then the last one I also like for the fact it's a kind of an example of government failure as well. So if we look at this one down here, the NBN Co's additional investment of $4.5 billion will bring ultra-fast broadband to millions of families and businesses across the economy over the next 2 years. If you look in the budget summary, there's a bit more information after this, but essentially what the government's doing here is going back to the old Labor government NBN plan of fibre to the home rather than copper, or fibre to the node than copper to the home, because it's faster. Essentially what this means is the government has done work and then is doing that work again to make it better like it was originally meant to be. So that's a real, although it is going to increase our aggregate supply now and improve our efficiency because the transport information, the internet's going to be better. It's also an example of wasting resources because if we didn't do it poorly the first time, we'd already have that and we wouldn't need to do that. That'd be 4.5 billion that could go to another source. It's a really good example at the moment for government failure, and the fact that they're now having to reallocate resources to get to the point that we need to be because people are working from home. We need effective internet. And then last couple, the government's building on its job trainer skills package to further support to encourage new apprentices, trainees into training, assist job seekers who lack basic language, literacy and numeracy skills to acquire these foundational skills. This is all about making people more employable. So giving people the skills they need through education and training. And that's really important for our aggregate supply. We've got a lot of skill shortages in certain areas, and we're going to have more in the near future. We need to get people to have those skills. And the only way to stop having so many people unemployed is to make their skills match up with what's going to exist in the future. Because the jobs that exist in the future aren't the same as what they are now. Many jobs that exist now are starting to cease to exist, and therefore we need to reskill people. So the job trainer package is really important for that, because then that makes them more employable, makes them more effective, and therefore, especially a lot of jobs were previously filled by migrants, which can no longer really occur with the borders being closed. So we need people internally to get those skills and then be able to fulfill those jobs. And the job trainer package helps with that. And lastly, the government is investing further in Australia's Australian training system and skills pipeline through 1.2 billion in boosting apprenticeships wage subsidy to support 100,000 new apprentices and trainees. That's what we were talking about before. The basically giving businesses a subsidy if they are bringing in apprentices and trainees. They'll pay part of the business's costs so they can pay them, gets more people employed, creates more jobs, etc. And so this is just a quick summary of some of the key things. The personal income tax cuts, use that like crazy. That's going to be such a useful tool for any aggregate demand side question. Infrastructure projects, just as an example of straight up government spending, so that 110 billion plan to spend on infrastructure projects. Talk about that as increasing G and the effect that has on aggregate demand and why, job creation, etc. And then all these aggregate supply side policies, there's so much going on right now to try and create jobs. I really feel like on the exam they're going to focus on employment and job creation, and to be able to talk about how some of these create jobs or give people the skills they need to do jobs. It's really, really, really important. I'll probably end up doing another one of these because it's very quick, reactionary to the thing. There's going to be a lot more in the budget that hasn't really come out already. But if you have any questions about these, feel free to send me a message or comment wherever. Other than that, I hope you enjoy the rest of your night. It's 8:16. The budget came out at 7:30. This is some quick turnaround. Have a great night, and I will see you next time. I'm going to go and watch Bob's Burgers now.